A warm summer day at an exclusive country club, filled with the hum of laughter, clinking glasses, and the sounds of families relaxing by the shimmering blue pool. The club was known for its exclusivity, for the way it catered to a very specific crowd, a crowd that, in the eyes of one particular security officer, had a clear, unspoken rule about who truly belonged. Among them, hidden in the folds of expensive towels and tasteful decor, was a quiet code that this place was meant to be a haven for certain people, those who looked and behaved in a particular way. As children splashed around in the water, a young child, maybe only 7 or 8, ran along the edge, laughing as he chased after a brightly colored pool toy. Suddenly, a misstep, a moment of lost balance, and he tumbled, slipping down into the deeper end of the pool. There was no splashy display, no dramatic scene. Just a single gulp of air, a wide-eyed look of panic, and he was gone beneath the surface. A nearby lifeguard, a young man eager to jump in, seemed poised to act, but a hand on his arm stopped him, a heavy, commanding grip from the officer on duty, a man with a sharp, almost cruel gaze, who looked down at the struggling boy with a cold, detached indifference. "Leave it," he murmured, his voice carrying a hint of disdain as he pulled the lifeguard back, eyes fixed on the pool as if waiting for something. "It's not our problem if he doesn't belong here." "But he's just a kid," the lifeguard protested, voice trembling, torn between duty and the authority looming over him. The officer's face twisted into a hard smile, full of quiet arrogance. "I decide who gets saved here. If they wanted him safe, they should have known better than to bring him here in the first place." The lifeguard looked around, helpless, while the boys struggled beneath the water continued, small fingers clawing up toward the surface. The laughter and chatting continued around the pool, oblivious, almost surreal in its indifference. Parents were there, children were there, but not a single person seemed to notice. And those who did catch sight of the scene either turned away or shot disapproving glances. No one would risk stepping in, not here, not at a place where appearances meant everything, and where stepping out of line could mean losing favor, or worse. But then, in the midst of the unfolding tragedy, there came a rush of movement from the club's entrance. A figure burst onto the scene, eyes locked on the pool, on the struggling form sinking deeper into the water. This man, the father, had an undeniable presence, a calm yet fierce determination in his gaze, a look that made it clear he would stop at nothing. Without a word to anyone, he sprinted to the edge of the pool, throwing off his coat and diving in without hesitation. The officer stiffened, eyes narrowing as he watched, his posture rigid, as though he were offended by the father's actions, as though a rule had been broken. The guests around the pool watched with mixed reactions, some alarmed, some amused, and others just curious to see how the situation would unfold. The father emerged from the water, his arms wrapped protectively around his son's small, frail frame, cradling him to his chest. Coughing, gasping, the boy clung to his father, eyes wide with the terror of the near drowning. Relief washed over the father's face, but as he looked up, his expression shifted to something steely, something unforgiving as he set his gaze on the officer who had stood by, watching as his son nearly drowned. "What kind of man lets a child drown?" he demanded, his voice low but laced with barely restrained fury, cutting through the air like a knife. The people around the pool fell silent, sensing the tension, feeling the weight of the father's anger. The officer, unfazed, shrugged, crossing his arms. "Rules are rules. He doesn't belong here. Neither do you, if you ask me." There was a smugness to his tone, a twisted sense of pride in enforcing his own distorted idea of order. A heavy silence settled over the pool area, punctuated only by the soft, shallow breaths of the rescued child, who clung tighter to his father. The father's jaw tightened, and a look passed over his face, one that held a promise. It was the kind of look that told everyone watching that this wasn't over, that there would be consequences, that this moment, this careless act of cruelty, wouldn't go unanswered. And then, as if to add fuel to the fire, the officer smirked, leaning in closer to the father, his voice a low, taunting murmur. "You people always think you can walk in here, just because you have money or titles. But respect? That's earned. He glanced pointedly at the boy, who was still trembling in his father's arms. "You don't belong here." "Neither does he." For a split second, the father's expression remained calm, almost unreadable, but behind his eyes was a storm-gathering force. He held his son close, his hands steady and strong, as though drawing from a deep reservoir of resilience. He didn't respond, didn't give the officer the satisfaction of seeing him snap, but there was something in his silence, a quiet promise that this act of cruelty wouldn't be ignored, that justice would find a way. The other guests, sensing the mounting tension, watched with a mix of fascination and discomfort. Some whispered among themselves, debating whether the father's anger was justified, while others kept their eyes averted, unwilling to acknowledge the ugliness unfolding in front of them. A low murmur rippled through the crowd as whispers spread, as rumors began to take shape about who the father was, about the kind of power he held. But the officer, blinded by his own prejudice, remained oblivious, or perhaps simply too proud to consider that he might have overstepped, that he might have made a fatal error. And then, in a calm, measured voice, the father spoke, his words carrying an authority that silenced even the boldest whispers. "You should be careful who you choose to ignore. This is a world of consequences." His words hung heavy in the air, a solemn promise, a warning that resonated long after he had carried his son away from the poolside, leaving behind a silence that was as chilling as it was profound. The officer chuckled, shaking his head, muttering something under his breath as he watched them go. But there was a flicker of unease, a fleeting shadow of doubt that crossed his face, as though a part of him realized, too late, that he might have crossed a line, that he might have set something irreversible in motion. In the days that followed, whispers spread through the club, ripples of speculation that grew with each passing hour. Members and staff alike found themselves wondering, who was that man? What power did he hold? And what, if anything, would he do in response to the blatant cruelty that had nearly cost his son his life? As the days turned into a tense, uneasy silence, there was one question that lingered, a question that gnawed at the minds of those who had witnessed the scene at the poolside. What kind of justice awaited the man who had turned a blind eye to a drowning child? And would it be swift, or would it come quietly, like the calm before a storm? The guests, the lifeguard, even the staff, each one found themselves holding their breath, waiting, wondering if and when retribution would arrive, and what form it might take. Would the officer finally realize the gravity of his actions? Or would he, like so many before him, simply shrug off the consequences, believing himself untouchable in a world where cruelty often goes unanswered? One thing was certain, the father had made a promise, and he was not a man who left promises unfulfilled. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces of the club, there lingered a sense of inevitability, a sense that justice, in some form or another, was coming. The question was, just how far would it go? Before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to say something important. Here at Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. We believe that every person deserves respect, dignity, and equality, no exceptions. If you're here today and you've ever felt the weight of injustice, know that this channel is a safe space for you. We're committed to sharing stories that shed light on these realities and bring hope, resilience, and, sometimes, a satisfying twist of justice. Now, settle in for a compelling story, and if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Let's jump in. The sun had reached its peak, casting a harsh, almost blinding light over the exclusive Riverton Country Club. Located on the edge of a pristine lake, the club was the kind of place where membership was passed down through generations, and the guests lounging by the water were familiar faces. To be a part of Riverton meant you belonged to a certain type of crowd, wealthy, predominantly white, and accustomed to an unspoken code of conduct that kept the club a safe haven for people who shared the same views, values, and expectations. The club's members lounged by the luxurious pool, surrounded by meticulously arranged lounge chairs, parasols, and lush gardens. A group of children splashed around in the water, their laughter mingling with the low hum of adult conversations. Parents observed their children from a distance, occasionally offering a reminder to be careful or come here for some sunscreen. The lifeguard, a young man in his early 20s named Derek, stood by, attentively scanning the pool as he kept his position at the lifeguard station. Derek was new to the club, freshly hired for the summer, and he was careful to follow every rule, every protocol, knowing that even a small misstep could cost him his job. And then there was Officer Bill Callahan, the club's private security guard, who had been with Riverton for years. Bill was known for his strict adherence to the rules of Riverton, and his unspoken code was as clear as the waters of the pool he patrolled. Certain people were welcome, others were tolerated, and a few were plainly unwelcome, no matter their wealth or connections. He had been known to keep a close eye on any outsiders who entered the club, convinced that some people simply didn't fit the image of Riverton's members. Callahan took his job seriously, perhaps a little too seriously, and most people could sense it. He walked around with an air of authority, his sharp eyes always alert, scanning for anyone who looked out of place. He'd gained a reputation among the club's regulars for his loyalty to the club's image, and while some found him overly strict, no one ever complained outright. Bill Callahan liked to think he was the unofficial gatekeeper of Riverton, an upholder of its values and traditions. He believed he was the embodiment of the club's ideals, a protector of its long-standing reputation. It was on this particular day, with the summer heat pressing down on the club and a busy crowd gathering for the weekend, that a new member, a man named Marcus Hayes, arrived with his family. Marcus wasn't just any new member, he was the state governor, recently elected and widely respected. He'd come with his wife and young son, Anthony, an energetic 7-year-old who wore a bright smile and bounced with excitement as he explored the club. Marcus Hayes had grown up in a modest neighborhood and had worked tirelessly to get where he was. He wasn't just a politician but a figure who stood for change, a man who had risen against the odds to hold one of the highest positions in the state. He was a black man in a predominantly white club, and his presence at Riverton carried a weight that was hard for some members to ignore. Though many club members greeted him politely, there was a tension, a palpable discomfort from certain individuals who felt his presence was somehow at odds with Riverton's exclusivity. Marcus, however, remained unfazed by the subtle stares and the whispers that trailed behind him. He had dealt with worse throughout his life and career, and he was here for a simple reason, to give his son a day of fun. This was about family, about enjoying time with Anthony, who had been eager to play by the pool. As Marcus settled into a lounge chair beside his wife, he let himself relax, finally able to tune out the pressures of his political life. Meanwhile, Anthony was filled with excitement, darting around the pool, his laughter echoing across the water. For him, this was a magical place, full of things to discover, and he was too young to sense the unease that followed his family. With a bright green pool toy in his hands, Anthony ran along the pool's edge, his bare feet leaving wet footprints as he chased the toy with the uninhibited joy only a child could muster. From his post, Derek, the lifeguard, kept a careful eye on Anthony, as he did with all the children. But Derek's vigilance wasn't entirely his own. He felt the weight of Officer Callahan's gaze, a silent demand that he maintain control, especially around this particular child. Derek could sense the tension from Callahan, who was watching Anthony with a look that was a mix of irritation and disdain. Every so often, Callahan would shift his stance, crossing his arms as he cast sharp glances at the boy, as if Anthony's mere presence by the pool was an intrusion. The tension came to a head when Anthony, distracted in his chase after the pool toy, slipped near the pool's deeper end. In an instant, his small body lost balance, and he tumbled forward, slipping beneath the surface of the water. There was no dramatic splash, no cry for help, just a silent, desperate flailing as he struggled, a look of pure panic in his eyes as he tried to reach the surface. Derek's instincts kicked in. He took a step forward, ready to dive in, but then he felt that familiar grip on his shoulder. Officer Callahan had moved quickly, intercepting him before he could jump in. Derek looked back in surprise, confused, his eyes meeting Callahan's harsh gaze. "Leave it," Callahan ordered, his voice low and firm. There was a finality to his tone, a command that left no room for argument. It's not our job to save someone who shouldn't be here in the first place. But he's just a kid. Derek's voice trembled as he tried to pull away, his instincts warring with his fear of losing his job. I can't just let him drown. Callahan's grip tightened, his eyes narrowing with a look of cold satisfaction. This isn't some public pool, he said with a sneer. If they want him safe, they should take him somewhere he belongs. This place isn't for people like him. Derek was frozen, torn between his duty to save a life and the fear of what disobeying Callahan could mean for his job. For a moment, he looked around, hoping that someone else might notice, that someone might intervene. But the guests nearby were either oblivious or choosing not to see, their eyes pointedly avoiding the unfolding tragedy. It was as if the poolside crowd had collectively decided that Anthony's life was inconsequential, that his presence was something they didn't have to acknowledge. At that moment, Marcus noticed the commotion from across the pool. The panic set in immediately as he saw his son's small figure beneath the water, struggling to stay afloat. Without a second thought, he sprang from his seat, discarding his jacket as he sprinted toward the pool. He was moving on pure instinct, driven by the unbreakable bond of a father's love. Callahan barely had time to react before Marcus dove into the water, cutting through the pool with powerful strokes until he reached Anthony. He lifted his son's trembling body out of the water, holding him close, whispering words of reassurance as Anthony clung to him, gasping for air, tears streaming down his face. The guests watched in a stunned silence, some exchanging uneasy glances, while others looked away, their discomfort palpable. But Marcus's gaze was fixed solely on his son, on the little boy he had just saved from an unimaginable terror. The world around him seemed to fade away as he held Anthony close, whispering words of comfort that only a father could give. Then, his eyes lifted, locking onto Callahan with a look that held a depth of anger and disappointment that words couldn't capture. He didn't have to speak for his feelings to be clear, his silence carried a weight, a message that hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. But Callahan met Marcus's gaze with a cold, unflinching expression, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth as he crossed his arms, as if daring Marcus to challenge him. To Callahan, this was a victory, a reinforcement of his beliefs about who belonged at Riverton and who didn't. In his mind, he'd done his job, upheld the club's unspoken rules, and now he stood unrepentant, waiting to see if Marcus would fight back. But instead of anger, a look of resolve settled over Marcus's face, a quiet, controlled determination that spoke of power, of an unwavering commitment to justice. It was the kind of resolve that had propelled him from his modest beginnings to the heights of political power, the kind that told everyone watching that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. As he held his son, he made a silent promise, one that resonated in the very depths of his being. He would not let this go unanswered. He would not allow his son, or any child, to be made to feel less than, to be treated as though his life didn't matter. Justice would be served, one way or another. And as the guests around the pool watched him walk away, carrying his son with a sense of dignity that defied the cruelty he'd just endured, a question hung in the air, a question that lingered long after the crowd had dispersed and the day's events began to fade from memory. How would Marcus Hayes, the state governor and father who had just saved his son from drowning while others stood by, choose to confront the man who had shown such heartless indifference? The days following the incident at Riverton Country Club were tense, like the heavy, charged silence before a storm. Marcus Hayes hadn't uttered a single word publicly about what had happened, not to his wife, not to his staff, not to the press. But those closest to him, those who understood the weight he carried every day as both a public figure and a father, sensed a shift in him, a quiet fury that simmered beneath his composed exterior. At his home office, Marcus sat in silence, replaying the moment at the pool over and over in his mind. The look of cold indifference in Officer Callahan's eyes, the sneer that barely concealed his contempt, the utter lack of humanity in his refusal to help Anthony. It was as though the man had looked right through his son, as if his life didn't count. And Marcus knew, deep in his heart, that this was about more than that one moment, it was a reflection of a much larger, uglier problem. Late one evening, Marcus finally broke the silence and called his chief of staff, Eleanor Porter. Eleanor was sharp, principled, and fiercely loyal, a woman who had worked beside him for years and who shared his vision for a more just, inclusive society. She arrived at his home promptly, her expression one of concern mixed with an understanding of what might be coming. "Eleanor," Marcus said as he greeted her, motioning for her to sit. He didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "I need your help. This can't go unanswered." Eleanor nodded, her gaze steady. She had seen Marcus stand up to injustice before, but this time was different. There was a deeply personal wound that needed tending, a father's anger mixed with the responsibility of a public servant. "I'm with you, Marcus. Whatever it is you need, you know I'll make it happen. But tell me, what do you have in mind?" Marcus leaned forward, his hands folded tightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "This man, Callahan, he's a symptom, Eleanor. He's just one piece of a much larger, systemic problem, and if we don't confront it, he'll just keep going, and others like him will think it's acceptable." He paused, his gaze hardening. "I want a full investigation. I want everything about him, about his record. I want the world to see exactly who this man is and what he stands for." Eleanor nodded slowly, processing his words. "An investigation could be complicated. We'd have to keep it discreet at first, especially given your position. But if you're willing to take this on, I'll make sure we have the resources." "It's not just about Callahan," Marcus continued, his voice carrying a resolve that left no room for doubt. "This is about Riverton, about places like Riverton that turn a blind eye to people like him. The club might not openly say it, but they enable this behavior, this mindset. They create the space where people like Callahan think they can get away with this." His jaw clenched. "It ends here, Eleanor. This won't just be about my son. This will be about every family who's ever been made to feel unwelcome, unworthy." As Eleanor took notes, Marcus's wife, Ava, entered the room quietly, her presence bringing a calm strength to the space. She sat beside Marcus, her hand resting gently on his. "This can't consume you, Marcus," she said softly, her eyes full of concern. "I know you want justice, and I'm behind you all the way, but, be careful. You know how people can twist things, especially with your position." He looked at her, the tension in his face softening momentarily. "I know, Ava. But this isn't just about me. Anthony deserves to know that his father fought for him, that he didn't let this slide. He deserves to grow up in a world where he's valued." Ava nodded, squeezing his hand. "Then we'll do it together." Eleanor cleared her throat, bringing them back to the task at hand. "First step is getting some evidence, something concrete that shows a pattern with Callahan. If we can find proof of other incidents, if we can speak with witnesses, maybe some of the staff who've seen him in action, it could strengthen our case." Marcus's gaze turned steely. "Do what you need to do. And Eleanor, this needs to be handled carefully. I don't want this blowing up until we're ready. This isn't just about ruining a man's career, it's about exposing a system." Eleanor set to work immediately, calling in contacts, arranging meetings, and subtly gathering information. Over the next few days, she spoke with former club staff members, lifeguards, and even a few members who'd left the club in the past. The more she uncovered, the clearer it became that Callahan's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. He had a history of policing the club in a way that reflected a deep-seated bias. Some former staff members recounted how he had prevented certain guests from entering, scrutinizing them more heavily if they didn't look the part. Others described him as a man who abused his authority, acting as though he alone had the power to decide who was welcome. Each piece of information brought Marcus closer to the truth, closer to understanding just how deep the rot went. And with each new revelation, his resolve hardened. He wasn't just fighting for his son anymore, he was fighting against a system that had allowed people like Callahan to thrive unchecked. Finally, Eleanor arranged a meeting with Derek, the young lifeguard who had been at the pool that day. He arrived at Marcus's office looking nervous, his eyes darting around as if afraid of being seen. Marcus greeted him warmly, sensing the young man's discomfort. "Thank you for coming, Derek," Marcus said, gesturing for him to sit. "I know this might feel intimidating, but I just want to hear what happened that day, from your perspective." Derek swallowed hard, glancing at Eleanor, who offered him a reassuring nod. "Mr. Hayes. I'm so sorry for what happened to your son. I wanted to jump in, I really did. But Officer Callahan, he stopped me. He grabbed my arm and told me not to help." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone calm. "Can you tell me exactly what he said, Derek?" Derek took a shaky breath, clearly nervous. He said it wasn't our job to save someone who didn't belong there. He said that if you'd wanted him safe, you should have kept him away from the pool." His voice cracked, and he looked down, ashamed. "I wanted to help. But I was scared. He has so much power there. He made it clear that if I crossed him, I'd be out of a job." The room fell silent, the weight of Derek's words hanging heavy in the air. Marcus exchanged a glance with Eleanor, both of them understanding the significance of this testimony. Here was proof, spoken by a witness, of Callahan's blatant disregard for the lives of those he deemed unworthy. "Thank you, Derek," Marcus said, his voice steady but laced with anger. "I know this wasn't easy for you, but you did the right thing by coming here. I promise you, this isn't going to be ignored. Callahan's actions will have consequences." Derek looked relieved, nodding gratefully before leaving the office. Once he was gone, Marcus turned to Eleanor, his expression grim. "It's time. Callahan needs to be held accountable, and I'm done waiting." Eleanor nodded, a fierce determination in her eyes. "Then we bring this to light. We release a statement, we present the evidence. And we make sure the people of Riverton, and beyond, know exactly what's been happening." In the days that followed, Marcus and Eleanor worked together to prepare a press release. They crafted every word carefully, each line written to convey the seriousness of the situation and the need for systemic change. And when the statement was ready, they released it to the press, ensuring that it would reach every corner of the community, every household, every individual who had ever set foot in Riverton. The reaction was immediate. News outlets picked up the story, and it spread like wildfire. People were shocked, horrified by the account of what had happened at Riverton, by the idea that such blatant prejudice could still exist in a place that prided itself on class and prestige. The club's members found themselves divided. Some were appalled, expressing their disgust and calling for Callahan's resignation, while others defended him, insisting that he had simply been doing his job. As the days went by, the pressure on Riverton Country Club grew. Protests began to form outside its gates, people demanding accountability, calling for a complete overhaul of the club's policies and leadership. Members withdrew their memberships, unwilling to be associated with a place that had harbored such hatred. And through it all, Callahan remained silent, holed up inside his home, refusing to speak to the press. But Marcus wasn't done. He knew that the court of public opinion was only one part of the equation. He wanted legal action, a formal investigation that would leave no stone unturned. He wanted Riverton and Callahan to face real, tangible consequences, the kind that couldn't be ignored or swept under the rug. And as the days passed, as the community's outrage continued to build, Marcus prepared for the next step in his plan. He knew that Callahan, a man who had spent years hiding behind his authority, would eventually have to face the reality of his actions. And when that day came, Marcus would be ready. The stage was set. The foundation had been laid. And as the tension mounted, as the anticipation grew, one question lingered in the air, a question that kept everyone on edge, waiting, wondering. What would happen when Callahan was finally forced to confront the man he had wronged? And how far was Marcus willing to go to ensure that justice was served? The days of quiet tension had culminated in a single, decisive confrontation at Riverton Country Club, the very place where this entire ordeal had begun. It was late afternoon, and the normally pristine, carefully maintained grounds were now shadowed by a gathering of reporters, protesters, and a few remaining club members, all waiting with hushed anticipation. The story had spread far and wide, everyone knew what was coming. This was the day that Officer Bill Callahan, the man whose reputation for enforcing unwritten rules had defined him, would face the consequences of his actions. Marcus Hayes stood by his car, dressed in a suit that seemed to exude both power and restraint. He looked out over the scene, his gaze steady as he prepared himself mentally for what he knew would be a defining moment, not just for himself and his family but for everyone who had been watching, waiting for a resolution. This was no longer just about personal revenge, it had become a matter of public accountability. He took a deep breath, steeling himself before heading toward the club's entrance. Inside, Officer Callahan paced back and forth, his once confident demeanor showing cracks as he glanced occasionally at the crowd outside. His usual smirk had vanished, replaced by a tension that betrayed his discomfort. This wasn't the club he was used to, a quiet sanctuary of privilege and control. Today, Riverton was under siege by something it had never encountered, the gaze of a world that would not look away. Finally, Callahan saw Marcus enter. His instinct was to scoff, to roll his eyes, but there was something in Marcus's demeanor that stopped him. Marcus wasn't here to argue or shout, his calm, resolute presence commanded the room, stripping away any semblance of control Callahan had over the situation. Marcus approached him, his gaze steady. "Officer Callahan," he began, his voice low but resonant, filling the room. "We have some things to discuss." Callahan let out a derisive laugh, masking his unease. "Oh, really? After everything you've stirred up, you think you can just waltz in here and make demands?" "I'm not here to make demands, Callahan. I'm here to make sure you understand the gravity of what you did. I want you to answer for it, publicly." Marcus's voice was calm, but every word was charged, precise, like a blade cutting through the silence. Callahan sneered, folding his arms as if trying to regain a sense of authority. "You're blowing this way out of proportion, Hayes. I did my job, just like I always do. And if you don't like it, maybe you should think twice about where you take your family." Marcus stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Callahan's. "Your job?" He shook his head slowly. "Tell me, what part of your job involves letting a child drown because you think he doesn't belong here?" Callahan's expression hardened, his jaw clenching. "Don't twist this into something it's not. You think you can come here with your fancy title and money, and everything's supposed to change? This place has standards, and it's not my fault if some people don't fit them." The crowd around them, composed of a mix of reporters, club staff, and curious onlookers, fell silent as the tension in the room intensified. The weight of Callahan's words, dripping with contempt and superiority, hung in the air, challenging Marcus, daring him to retaliate. Marcus took a step back, his hands clasped in front of him. "Standards? Is that what you call this? Ignoring a child's life because of your prejudices?" Callahan scoffed. "This isn't about prejudice. It's about keeping things in order, protecting what Riverton stands for. We don't need people like you causing chaos, thinking you can walk in and change everything. People like me." Marcus's voice was steady, but the edge in it was unmistakable. "Let me tell you something, Callahan. This isn't about me trying to change Riverton. This is about basic human decency, about ensuring that no family has to fear for their child's life because someone like you is deciding who's worthy of protection." A faint murmur rippled through the crowd, and Marcus sensed the shift, the support building around him, as his words resonated with those listening. "Enough with the lecture, Hayes." Callahan's voice was sharp, defensive. "You're not some kind of hero. You're just another politician using this as a soapbox, trying to make yourself look good. But I know who really belongs here, and it's not you or your kind." The words hit hard, a shocking display of the unfiltered contempt that Callahan could no longer disguise. Marcus's gaze darkened, his hands clenching slightly at his sides. But instead of reacting with anger, he took a steadying breath, his expression calm and focused. "If you truly believe that, Callahan," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper, "then you're in for a rude awakening." At that moment, Eleanor stepped forward, holding a stack of papers in her hands. She looked to Marcus, who gave her a nod, signaling her to proceed. She turned to the crowd, her voice clear and unwavering. "These are reports from former employees, testimonies that describe a consistent pattern of prejudice and abuse from Officer Callahan. We've gathered statements from lifeguards, maintenance workers, and even some club members who witnessed his actions over the years." Her eyes locked on Callahan. "This isn't just about one incident. This is about years of unchecked behavior that no one was willing to confront, until now." Callahan's face drained of color as he stared at the papers in her hands, realizing the weight of what she was saying. He glanced around, seeing the accusatory stares from the crowd, feeling his grip on the club, on his reputation, slipping through his fingers. "That's ridiculous," he stammered, his voice losing its edge. "You can't believe any of that. These people are just trying to drag me down because of some vendetta." "Vendetta?" Marcus's voice was cold, unyielding. "You call this a vendetta? This is about justice, Callahan. It's about holding people accountable for their actions." Callahan's gaze darted to the exit, a flicker of desperation crossing his face as he realized there was no escape. He tried to salvage his composure, straightening his posture and turning to the crowd. "You people don't understand," he pleaded, his voice cracking slightly. "I was just doing my job, keeping things in order. This is a misunderstanding. A smear campaign." But the murmurs from the crowd told a different story. The people who had once looked to him as a figure of authority were now looking at him with disgust, with the dawning realization that the very man they trusted had been the embodiment of the prejudice that had festered beneath Riverton's polished surface. Eleanor stepped forward again, her expression resolute. "There will be an investigation, Callahan. A formal, legal investigation. And I can assure you that every witness, every former employee, will have a chance to tell their story. You won't be able to hide behind your badge or this club's reputation any longer." The weight of Eleanor's words seemed to settle over Callahan, and for the first time, his arrogance gave way to fear. He looked around, realizing he was truly alone, that the people who had once respected him now saw him for what he truly was. Marcus took a step closer to Callahan, his voice steady but carrying the weight of everything that had led to this moment. "My son nearly died because of your hatred, Callahan. And you stood there, watched him struggle, because you decided he wasn't worth saving. I won't let you hide behind excuses or dismiss this as some misunderstanding. Today, you're going to answer for it." Callahan took a step back, visibly shaken, his hands trembling slightly as he struggled to hold on to any shred of control. But it was clear that he had lost, that his reign over Riverton was over, that the truth had finally caught up with him. And as he stood there, cornered and exposed, Marcus saw a flicker of something in Callahan's eyes, a momentary glimpse of regret, of fear. But it was too little, too late. The damage had been done, and now, justice would be served. The silence that followed was thick with anticipation, with the realization that the scales of power had shifted, that Riverton would never be the same. And as Marcus turned to leave, Eleanor by his side, he felt a sense of closure, of vindication, not just for himself and his family, but for everyone who had been wronged by a system that had allowed people like Callahan to thrive. Outside, as Marcus walked toward his car, the crowd parted, a hush falling over them as they watched him, their expressions filled with a newfound respect. Marcus looked out at them, his gaze steady, unbroken, a silent reminder that this fight, this struggle for justice, was far from over. For Callahan, the reckoning had come. But for Marcus, this was just the beginning of a larger battle, one that he knew would continue beyond the walls of Riverton. And as he drove away, the echoes of that confrontation lingered, a promise that justice, once begun, would never be silenced. As Marcus made his way back to his car, he felt the weight of what had just happened settle over him. The confrontation with Callahan had been necessary, a decisive moment that everyone had witnessed, but he knew that there were still conversations left unfinished, emotions left unspoken. And perhaps, he realized, there was something more he needed to do, not for himself, but for his son. Just as he opened the car door, a voice called out from behind him. "Governor Hayes." It was Eleanor, hurrying over, her expression serious yet filled with a quiet pride. He turned to her, managing a faint smile. "Eleanor. Thank you for everything today. I couldn't have done this without you." Eleanor nodded, her eyes glinting with a mixture of admiration and resolve. "Marcus, there's something you should know. Callahan's not the only one. While digging into his background, I found names of people who've defended him, turned a blind eye to his behavior." She paused, gauging his reaction. "It's a larger network than we realized. Riverton system, it's deeply ingrained." Marcus sighed, nodding. "I had a feeling. This isn't just one man's prejudice. It's a system that's allowed him and others like him to thrive. But we'll take them all down, Eleanor. Bit by bit." Eleanor reached into her bag, pulling out a file thick with documents and handwritten notes. "I've compiled everything I could find. Witness testimonies, statements, even some records that hint at financial incentives. It's as if they're rewarded for keeping Riverton clean. I'll leave this with you." Marcus took the file, a sense of gravity settling over him as he realized just how much work lay ahead. But before he could speak, he caught sight of someone watching from the corner of the parking lot, Derek, the lifeguard who had witnessed the incident. The young man looked hesitant, as though he wanted to approach but wasn't sure he had the right. "Derek," Marcus called, waving him over. Derek approached slowly, his face tense but determined. "Governor Hayes. I just wanted to say. I'm sorry. I should have done something that day." "I should have," Marcus held up a hand, stopping him. "You did what you could, Derek. I know Callahan put you in an impossible position. I don't blame you. You've been brave to come forward." Derek looked down, swallowing hard. "It doesn't feel brave. I feel like I failed. I let that man intimidate me, and I didn't protect your son." Marcus placed a reassuring hand on Derek's shoulder. "Listen to me. You're young, and you did the best you could under the circumstances. Standing up now, telling the truth, that takes courage. You don't need to carry this burden. What happened, it was Callahan's doing, and he's the one who will answer for it." Derek nodded slowly, his eyes bright with a mixture of relief and guilt. "Thank you. It means a lot to hear that. I want to make it right." Eleanor, who had been watching the exchange, stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. "Derek, if you're willing, you can help us in another way. Riverton's been operating under this unspoken code for years, and the only way we can break it is with people like you, people who know the inside, who've seen it firsthand." Derek looked from Eleanor to Marcus, a newfound resolve in his eyes. "I'll do it. Whatever you need. I'm done standing by." Marcus gave him a nod of respect. "Thank you, Derek. Your courage will make a difference. And remember, you're not alone in this." Derek took a step back, nodding before heading off, his shoulders less heavy than before. As Marcus watched him go, he felt a sense of satisfaction, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, Riverton's walls of prejudice were beginning to crack. Later that evening, as Marcus returned home, he found his son, Anthony, sitting quietly on the living room couch, his gaze distant. Marcus's heart tightened as he saw the lingering sadness in Anthony's eyes, the weight of an experience no child should have to bear. He sat beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "Hey, buddy," Marcus said softly. "How are you feeling?" Anthony looked up at him, a mix of confusion and hurt in his young eyes. Dad, why did that man hate me? The question was like a punch to Marcus's chest, a reminder of the pain his son had endured. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes, people don't understand others who are different from them, Anthony. They let their own fears or their own ideas get in the way of treating people with kindness. But I didn't do anything to him. Why would he just stand there? Anthony's voice cracked, and he looked down, struggling to hold back tears. Was it because of me? No, Marcus said firmly, pulling him closer. This was not your fault, Anthony. There is nothing wrong with you. That man, he made a terrible, cruel choice, and it had nothing to do with who you are. You're strong, kind, and brave, and don't ever let anyone make you feel less than that. Anthony nodded, but Marcus could see that the questions still lingered, that the hurt still ran deep. He knew this was a wound that would take time to heal, a lesson that he would have to revisit with his son, reassuring him over and over until he truly believed it. After a long silence, Anthony looked up, his gaze steady. Are you going to stop him, Dad? Marcus met his son's eyes, a fierce determination blazing in his own. Yes, I am. And not just him. I'm going to make sure that places like Riverton are held accountable, so that no other child has to feel what you felt. I promise you that, Anthony. They sat together in silence, a quiet understanding passing between them. In that moment, Marcus knew that his fight was not only a battle for justice but also a way of teaching his son that standing up for what was right, no matter how difficult, was a path worth walking. The following week, Marcus's office was flooded with calls and messages. The press had taken hold of the story, and the demand for accountability was growing. News outlets covered Riverton's toxic culture, exposing the deep-seated prejudice that had thrived within its walls for years. Callahan was formally suspended pending investigation, and a legal team was assembled to dig deeper into the club's practices. But for Marcus, this wasn't enough. He wanted a face-to-face confrontation with Callahan, a final reckoning. He arranged a meeting, one that would take place in a quiet, neutral location, a small conference room, bare and plain, where there would be no distractions, no club members or security guards to intervene. As Callahan entered the room, his demeanor was no longer arrogant but deflated, weary. Gone was the smug confidence, replaced by a look of unease as he took a seat across from Marcus. Marcus watched him, taking in the sight of the man who had caused so much pain, who had nearly cost his son his life without a second thought. After a long, tense silence, Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm but unyielding. Do you understand what you've done? Callahan's gaze shifted uncomfortably, and he gave a small shrug, his voice laced with a defiance that hadn't entirely left him. I did my job, Governor. I was doing what I thought was best. Marcus's eyes narrowed, his voice steady and cold. Your job? You think it's your job to decide who's worthy of being saved? Callahan met his gaze, a flicker of anger breaking through his mask of indifference. You think you're so much better, don't you? Coming in here, telling me how to do my job. You have no idea what it's like, dealing with the people who come through that place. I was protecting Riverton. Marcus leaned forward, his voice low and deadly. Protecting Riverton from what? A child? My son. Callahan's face twisted with frustration, his hands clenching into fists. I was keeping order. Riverton has standards, and people like you don't get it. You think because you have a title, you can change everything, make everything bend to your will. No, Callahan, Marcus said, his voice unwavering. I don't want everything to bend to my will. I want a world where people, regardless of what they look like or where they come from, are treated with basic respect. What you did to my son, there's no justification for that. You let your prejudice dictate your actions, and you almost let a child drown because of it. The silence in the room was thick, the weight of Marcus's words hanging in the air. Callahan looked away, his jaw tight, refusing to acknowledge the truth that was now undeniable. Marcus continued, his voice filled with a restrained fury. You can try to hide behind excuses, Callahan, but the world knows what kind of man you are now. Your career, your reputation, it's over. You'll be remembered not as a protector but as a coward who let a child suffer because of his own hatred. Callahan's face twisted with rage, a final burst of anger breaking through his restraint. This isn't over, Hayes. You think you've won, but people like you, always stirring up trouble, always demanding things change, you'll see. You'll be gone, but Riverton will stay the same. People will keep coming back, and they'll keep it just the way it's always been. Marcus's gaze was unflinching, calm. Maybe. But there are more of us every day. More people who won't let this go unchallenged. And one day, people like you will have nowhere left to hide. He stood up, his posture tall and resolute, a silent finality in his movements as he turned to leave. I don't need to fight you anymore, Callahan. You're fighting a losing battle against a world that's moving forward, with or without you. As Marcus walked out of the room, he felt a sense of release, of closure. Callahan was left behind, a relic of a world that was slowly, inevitably crumbling. And as he stepped outside into the cool evening air, he knew that his fight was far from over, but that today, he had won a small, significant victory. A victory that, one day, he would be able to tell his son about. A victory that, for now, was enough. As the dust began to settle from the explosive confrontation between Marcus Hayes and Officer Callahan, the ripple effects were only just beginning to take shape. Marcus had exposed a deeply rooted prejudice not just in one man, but within an entire institution, an institution that had long held itself above the principles of equality and fairness. Now, Riverton Country Club, with its once pristine reputation, faced the full weight of public scrutiny. News outlets covered the fallout extensively, painting Riverton as a relic of a bygone era, clinging to values that had no place in a modern, inclusive society. The club's board members found themselves inundated with calls from reporters, members, and even city officials demanding answers. Some of Riverton's wealthiest patrons had already cancelled their memberships, unwilling to be associated with a place now synonymous with racial prejudice and exclusion. Others clung to their memberships, arguing that they were being unfairly targeted, that Riverton's traditions should be respected. In the midst of this turmoil, Marcus faced a moral dilemma of his own. The exposure of Riverton's deep-seated prejudice was a victory, yes, but a small one in the grand scheme of things. He knew that systemic change required more than a single confrontation, it demanded sustained effort and commitment. And as the public's interest in the story began to grow, he faced a decision that would test the very core of his principles. One afternoon, as he sat in his office reflecting on the events that had unfolded, Eleanor entered, her expression serious. She carried with her a file that was thicker than before, filled with documents, reports, and evidence that could, if released, decimate what was left of Riverton's reputation. Marcus, she began, her voice measured, we have a choice to make. With everything we've gathered, we could launch a formal investigation into Riverton's practices, not just Callahan's actions, but the entire culture. It could mean legal battles, it could mean years of pushing against an institution that won't go down without a fight. She paused, watching his reaction carefully. But it also means we'd be making enemies. Powerful ones. Marcus looked at the file, the weight of it symbolic of the burden he now carried. He was torn between the desire to protect his family, to ensure their safety and peace, and the call to confront a system that had harmed countless others. Riverton was just one institution, but it represented a larger network of power and privilege that was resistant to change. Taking it on would mean more than just putting Callahan out of a job, it would mean dismantling a culture that had thrived on exclusion and prejudice. After a moment, Marcus looked up at Eleanor, his gaze steady. Eleanor, what would happen if we don't pursue this? She took a deep breath. If we don't move forward, Riverton will likely try to sweep this under the rug. They'll issue a few statements, maybe fire Callahan to appease the public, but the club's culture will stay the same. And sooner or later, there'll be another Callahan. Another person who thinks they can judge who belongs. Marcus nodded, the reality settling over him. Then we don't have a choice, do we? Eleanor gave a faint smile, her eyes filled with admiration. I didn't think you'd back down. I just wanted to make sure you understood what you were getting into. Marcus sighed, leaning back in his chair. I know what this means. I know that pushing forward could expose my family to more scrutiny, more attacks. But I also know that if I don't do this, if I don't stand up now, then everything I've fought for, everything I've tried to teach Anthony about standing up for what's right, it'll all mean nothing. With the decision made, Marcus and Eleanor got to work. They prepared a formal complaint, detailing the culture of prejudice at Riverton and outlining the testimonies they'd gathered from former employees. They coordinated with legal advisors, activists, and local government officials who were willing to support the investigation, recognizing that this wasn't just about Riverton but about the broader implications for their community. Meanwhile, the media continued to cover the fallout, and Marcus became a target for those who felt their way of life was under attack. His inbox overflowed with hate mail, and his office received threatening calls, accusing him of trying to destroy a respected institution. Friends and colleagues warned him that taking on Riverton was dangerous, that he could be risking his career, his reputation, even his family's safety. But Marcus remained undeterred, driven by the promise he'd made to his son and by the responsibility he felt to protect others from the harm Riverton had caused. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings and preparations, Marcus returned home to find Anthony waiting for him in the living room, a look of quiet determination on his face. Marcus could see that his son had been waiting to talk, and he sat down beside him, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility as he prepared for their conversation. Dad, Anthony began, his voice hesitant but firm, why are people so mad at you? Marcus took a moment to gather his thoughts, knowing that his answer would shape the way his son understood everything that had happened. Sometimes, when you try to change something that's been around for a long time, people get scared. They're afraid of losing what they know, even if what they know isn't fair or right. Anthony looked down, clearly struggling to understand. But, why would they want to keep something that hurts people? Marcus sighed, placing a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. Because, for some people, it's easier to ignore the problem than to face it. It's easier to pretend that things are fine, that people like Callahan don't exist. But just because it's easier doesn't mean it's right. That's why we're doing this, Anthony. So that people can't ignore it anymore. Anthony nodded slowly, his face reflecting both the confusion of a child and the budding awareness of someone beginning to grasp the complexities of the world. So, you're doing this so other kids don't get hurt? Yes, buddy, Marcus said softly. I'm doing this so that no other kid has to go through what you did. And so that one day, people won't have to fight so hard just to be treated fairly. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation settling over them. Marcus could see that his son understood, in his own way, the importance of what they were fighting for. And in that moment, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder of why he had chosen this path despite the challenges. The weeks that followed were intense. Riverton Country Club's board held an emergency meeting, their members scrambling to contain the growing scandal. They issued statements of apology, announced diversity training initiatives, and suspended Callahan indefinitely, but it was clear that their efforts were more about damage control than genuine change. The media dissected each of Riverton's moves, and the pressure from the public continued to mount. Then, one day, Marcus received an unexpected call from the club's chairman, Richard Crawford, a man known for his wealth, influence, and his dedication to keeping Riverton's reputation pristine. Crawford was not the kind of person who reached out casually, and Marcus knew that this call was about more than just a simple conversation. Governor Hayes, Crawford began, his tone polite but with an undercurrent of urgency. I believe we need to speak, face to face. This situation with Riverton, it's spiraling out of control, and I'd like to discuss a possible resolution. Marcus paused, considering the offer. He knew that Crawford wasn't calling out of remorse or regret. This was about protecting Riverton's image, about saving the club from the consequences of its own actions. But he also knew that this meeting could provide an opportunity to push for real change, to demand accountability on a level that the club had never faced. "All right, Mr. Crawford," Marcus replied evenly. "I'll meet with you. But know this, I'm not interested in sweeping this under the rug. If you want a resolution, it needs to address the root of the problem." Crawford's silence on the other end was telling. But finally, he agreed, setting a time for the following afternoon. When Marcus arrived at the club for the meeting, the atmosphere was markedly different from his previous visits. The grandeur and exclusivity that once permeated every corner of Riverton felt hollow, as though the very walls knew that something had shifted. He was led to a private office where Crawford waited, his expression a carefully constructed mask of professionalism and control. "Governor Hayes," Crawford greeted him, extending a hand with a forced smile. "Thank you for coming." Marcus shook his hand, his own expression guarded. "Let's get straight to the point, Mr. Crawford. You wanted a resolution. I'm listening." Crawford took a deep breath, folding his hands on the table before him. "Governor Hayes, I understand that there have been unfortunate incidents here at Riverton. And as chairman, I take full responsibility for addressing those incidents. We're prepared to implement changes, diversity initiatives, sensitivity training. I can assure you, we'll make Riverton a more inclusive place." Marcus raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Initiatives and training won't fix what's broken here, Mr. Crawford. This isn't just about appearances, it's about accountability. Your club allowed people like Callahan to operate without oversight, and now you're trying to clean up after the fact." Crawford's facade cracked slightly, frustration seeping through. "Governor, we're doing what we can. Riverton has been a respected institution for generations. I'm asking you to consider that dismantling it, dragging its name through the mud, will only harm everyone involved." Marcus leaned forward, his gaze unflinching. "If Riverton's reputation is damaged, it's because of the choices its leadership has made, choices to ignore discrimination, to protect people who think they're above basic decency. I'm not here to protect Riverton, Mr. Crawford. I'm here to make sure it's held accountable." Crawford sighed, leaning back in his chair as he realized that his usual tactics weren't going to work. "Governor Hayes, there has to be a middle ground. I'm willing to make concessions, to implement meaningful changes, if you'll agree to withdraw the investigation." Marcus's eyes narrowed, the weight of Crawford's words settling over him. This was the moral dilemma, the choice between accepting a compromise that would likely lead to superficial change or pushing forward, knowing that the full investigation could lead to the club's closure, to the complete dismantling of Riverton's legacy. He took a deep breath, his mind racing as he considered his options. In that quiet, heavy moment in Richard Crawford's office, Marcus Hayes looked at the man across from him and knew that any form of compromise would only be a temporary bandage. Riverton Country Club would make empty gestures, enforce superficial changes, and in a few months, it would slip back into the same comfortable prejudices that had defined it for generations. A half measure would be a betrayal to everyone Riverton had hurt, including his own son. Marcus stood his ground. "Mr. Crawford," he said, voice unwavering, "I will not withdraw the investigation. Riverton's culture isn't something that can be corrected by mere promises or short-term fixes. This institution has harmed too many people, and those people deserve justice. Real justice." Crawford's face tightened, but there was an air of resignation in his eyes as he realized that Marcus would not yield. Marcus's resolve had struck a blow that the club couldn't recover from. The investigation proceeded, and in the weeks that followed, evidence mounted, exposing Riverton's long-standing culture of discrimination. Witnesses stepped forward, sharing stories of their experiences at the club, describing how their families had been quietly discouraged from joining, how their children had faced subtle exclusion on the playgrounds, or how staff members had been subjected to demeaning treatment. Under intense scrutiny, the board of Riverton Country Club found itself with no choice but to announce a temporary closure. Members and sponsors withdrew their support, unwilling to be associated with a place that had become synonymous with prejudice and abuse of power. The Riverton name, once prestigious, was now tarnished beyond repair. Meanwhile, Callahan's life took a drastic turn. With his career in ruins and his reputation in tatters, he faced a steep, lonely descent. The people he'd once considered friends, allies, and even admirers, all distanced themselves. The security company he worked for terminated his employment, and he was met with rejection after rejection from potential employers who didn't want the backlash associated with hiring him. His arrogance and conviction that he was untouchable had finally caught up with him, leaving him isolated in the very society he had once sought to protect from people he deemed unworthy. As for Marcus, the outcome was bittersweet. The victory came at a price. The battle had left him exhausted, but he'd succeeded in his mission to hold Riverton accountable. More importantly, he had upheld a promise to his son, to stand up for justice, no matter the cost. In the aftermath, he had received messages of support and gratitude from people all over the country who had experienced similar prejudices in their communities. Families of all backgrounds reached out to share their stories, and it was clear to Marcus that his actions had made an impact that went far beyond Riverton. One evening, as he sat with Anthony on their porch, they watched the sunset together, a quiet, peaceful moment they hadn't shared in what felt like a long time. Anthony seemed lighter, his spirit gradually restored in the days after his father had stood up for him and for others like him. "Dad," Anthony said quietly, breaking the silence, "are people going to stop doing things like that, like what that man did?" Marcus looked at his son, searching for the right words. "I hope so, Anthony. But I can't promise that it will change right away. Change takes time, and there are still people who don't understand or don't want to understand. But what we did here, it's a step forward. And every step forward brings us closer to the kind of world we want to live in." Anthony nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "So, it's not over yet?" Marcus smiled, feeling a surge of pride at his son's wisdom. "No, it's not over. But what we did here, it made a difference. And one day, if more people keep standing up, things will change. We just have to keep fighting for it." Anthony leaned into his father's side, finding comfort in the strength and warmth that had carried them through this storm. In that moment, Marcus felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment, not because he had won a battle, but because he had kept his integrity, had shown his son that courage and justice mattered, even when they came at a personal cost. In the following weeks, Marcus continued his work, using his position as governor to introduce policies and initiatives that would address discrimination in private institutions. He spoke publicly about Riverton, not as a cautionary tale but as a turning point, a symbol of accountability. His actions sparked conversations across the state and the country, prompting similar investigations in other exclusive clubs and institutions. Riverton became the first of many, a catalyst for systemic change that had been long overdue. Marcus's journey wasn't about bringing down one institution, it was about challenging the foundations of exclusion and prejudice that had silently governed so many places. He knew that change wouldn't come quickly, but he took solace in knowing that he had ignited a spark, a movement toward justice and fairness that would continue to grow. As for Riverton Country Club, its temporary closure soon became permanent. In its place, a community organization acquired the land, transforming it into a public park, a space open to families of all backgrounds, a place where children could play and swim without fear, where families could gather without judgment or exclusion. The park became a powerful symbol of change, a reminder of what could be achieved when people stood together against injustice. The transformation of Riverton into a public park wasn't just a symbolic victory, it was a tangible one. Families who had once been turned away were now free to enjoy the space, to reclaim it in a way that celebrated unity and inclusion. And Marcus, whenever he visited with his family, felt a quiet pride in knowing that the land had been repurposed into something good, something meaningful. For Callahan, life continued to unravel. Public opinion had condemned him, and he found himself ostracized from the very society he had sought to serve with his twisted sense of order. Alone and jobless, he was forced to confront the consequences of his actions, to reckon with the prejudice and hatred that had led him to that fateful decision. In the end, Callahan faded from public view, a cautionary figure who had learned too late the cost of his choices. As for Marcus, he knew that the battle he'd fought would be one of many, but he felt renewed in his purpose. His journey hadn't just been about holding Riverton accountable, it had been about setting an example, about showing his son and the world that change was possible, that justice could be achieved when people were willing to stand up for it. And in the quiet moments, when he looked at his son's hopeful face, he knew that the legacy he was building was one of courage, resilience, and integrity. This story isn't just about Marcus, his son, or even Riverton. It's a story about the courage it takes to confront systems that have been broken for far too long. It's about standing up, even when it feels like you're standing alone, because justice isn't always the easy path, but it's the right one. How many times have we looked the other way, ignored an injustice, or stayed silent to avoid conflict? This story challenges each of us to ask ourselves, what would we do in Marcus's position? Would we be willing to fight for what's right, no matter the cost? And maybe it's not just about big, public fights, it's about the small acts of courage in our daily lives. Every time we speak up, every time we refuse to let prejudice go unchecked, we're taking a step toward a more just world. So, I want to leave you with a question: what kind of world do you want to help build? Thank you for being here with us for this story. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in the importance of justice and accountability, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist. We share stories that remind us of the power of courage, the necessity of resilience, and the strength it takes to fight for change. Join us, and let's continue exploring stories that inspire, challenge, and make us think. Don't forget to subscribe, and let's stand together for a better world.